What if I told you that 6 U.S. states, not cities, not territories, actual American states, could quietly drift away from the U.S. and join Canada? No tanks, no invasions, just one big political shift, and boom, new flags, new passports, a new national identity. Sounds like a fantasy, right? But stick around, because these states are already more Canadian than most people realize. From healthcare to hockey, from trade to values, they're practically Canadian already. And trust me, number 1 will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about the U.S. map. Number 6, Oregon. Oregon, one of America's most unique states, suddenly decided it might belong somewhere else entirely. Like Canada? It sounds wild, but let's talk about Oregon. At first glance, Oregon looks like your typical West Coast, liberal-leaning state. But if you look a little closer, you'll see it shares a lot more in common with Canada, especially the province of British Columbia, than with much of the U.S. Oregon is big on the environment, climate action, and progressive politics, just like Canada. Their values? Pretty similar. In fact, when it comes to things like healthcare, labor rights, and protecting nature, Oregon's policies match up more with Canadian provinces than with its American neighbors. And it's not just about values, it's about business. Every year, over $4 billion in goods and services move between Oregon and Canada. That includes forest products, tech, and clean energy. This trade is a lifeline for Oregon's economy. Now, some people in Oregon's rural areas support the Greater Idaho movement, wanting to leave Oregon and join Idaho. But others are thinking even bigger. What if Oregon left the U.S. entirely and joined Canada? It may sound extreme, but if federal laws start going in a direction Oregon strongly disagrees with, like cutting environmental protections, the idea might not seem so crazy after all. So could Oregon really turn Canadian overnight? Maybe not tomorrow, but if one major event pushed them far enough, it's not impossible. And believe it or not, the next state we'll talk about is even more tied to Canada. If it lost that connection, its economy could collapse. Number 5, Alaska. Imagine living in Alaska, the rugged, remote land known as the last frontier. You're thousands of miles from Washington, D.C., but just a stone's throw from Canada. In fact, parts of Alaska are closer to Canadian cities than to the continental United States. And that's not just geography. It's a sign of deeper connections that go way beyond the map. Economically, Alaska and Canada are tightly woven together. From oil pipelines to seafood exports to mining ventures, Canadian companies are deeply invested in Alaska's natural resources. Canadian ports even play a key role in Alaskan trade routes. Take away those cross-border ties, and Alaska's economy would take a serious hit. But there's more than just money on the line. Alaska and Canada are already united on the military front through NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. In the event of a major crisis, these two regions might coordinate faster with each other than with the rest of the U.S. The alliance is that strong. Historically, Alaska has always been a bit of an outsider. It wasn't even part of the U.S. until 1867 when it was purchased from Russia. Since then, it's maintained a fiercely independent identity, one that often aligns more closely with Canadian ideals on the environment and Indigenous rights than with policies from Washington. So what happens if America faces a political meltdown or an economic breakdown? Alaska might start to wonder if its future lies not with the lower 48, but with its northern neighbor. And believe it or not, the next state on our list has even deeper Canadian ties, so strong that if it flipped flags tomorrow, most people wouldn't even flinch. Number 4, Vermont. Vermont, a small state with a big independent streak. Long before it joined the United States in 1791, Vermont was actually its own republic. That spirit of going it alone? It never really left. And today, Vermont's values and lifestyle often feel more aligned with Canada than with much of America. Culturally and politically, Vermont is deeply progressive. From universal healthcare discussions to environmental protection, its policies echo those found just across the border in Quebec and Ontario. In fact, Vermont and Quebec aren't just neighbors, they're partners. The two regions share robust trade connections, with industries like agriculture, green energy, and tourism flowing seamlessly between them. But here's where it gets really interesting. There are actual movements in Vermont that advocate for breaking away from the U.S. The Second Vermont Republic is one such group, and while it's small, it's persistent. Some of its supporters argue that Vermont could thrive better as an independent nation, or even as part of Canada. And when you look at it practically, the case isn't that far-fetched. Economically, Vermont already works hand-in-hand with Canadian provinces. Its clean energy goals, social policies, and even cultural values, from love of the outdoors to a deep appreciation for maple syrup, all align with Canadian sensibilities. So what happens if America's political divisions grow even deeper? Could Vermont, with its history of independence and strong northern ties, be one of the first to seriously consider switching sides? And if that sounds surprising, wait until you see the next state. Its reliance on Canada is so deep that if that relationship ended, its entire economy could be on the brink. Number 3, Michigan. Michigan, a state where becoming part of Canada might not just be a fantasy, but a surprisingly practical idea. Michigan's connection to Canada runs deeper than just a shared border. Economically, culturally, and even physically, these two are tied at the hip. Every year, more than $80 billion worth of goods cross the Michigan-Canada border, making it one of the busiest and most crucial trade relationships in North America. The Detroit-Windsor corridor alone sees thousands of trucks daily, moving everything from auto parts to agricultural products. Speaking of cars, Michigan's iconic auto industry wouldn't exist as we know it without Canada. Many vehicles are literally built across borders, with engines from Ontario and frames from Detroit. Cut that connection, and the heart of Michigan's economy would skip a beat. But it goes further than just money and manufacturing. Michigan shares critical infrastructure with Canada: bridges, tunnels, even sections of the electric grid. One of the busiest border crossings, the Ambassador Bridge, is actually owned by a Canadian. And yes, Michigan imports power from Canada too. These aren't just neighbors, they're codependent. And here's a historical twist. After the Toledo War in the 1830s, there was real discussion about Michigan aligning with Canada instead of the U.S. It didn't happen, but that moment in history shows how the idea isn't as wild as it might sound today. So imagine a future where Michigan sees more opportunity aligning with Ottawa than Washington, especially if political or economic turmoil ever rocked the U.S. Would Michigan really turn its back on the Stars and Stripes? Maybe not tomorrow, but if any state could make the leap, it's this one. And if you thought that was close, wait until you hear about a state whose culture and economy are already so Canadian, you'd barely notice if the switch happened overnight. Number 2, Minnesota. Minnesota might just surprise you when it comes to its ties to Canada. At first glance, you wouldn't think of it as being particularly Canadian, but the deeper you look, the more you see how intertwined the state is with its northern neighbor. Let's start with geography. Minnesota shares nearly 550 miles of border with Canada. But the bond between these two regions goes much further than just the physical divide. In 2023, Minnesota exported a whopping $7 billion worth of goods to Canada, making the country one of the state's biggest economic partners. That's not just a small portion of Minnesota's economy, it's a crucial chunk that keeps the wheels turning. And while economics are key, the connections don't stop there. Minnesota and Canada share a love for the great outdoors, the cold winters, and even the laid-back, friendly vibe. In fact, if you've ever been to Minnesota, you might have even been mistaken for a Canadian. The accent, the way people greet each other, it all feels remarkably similar. But wait, there's more. Politically, Minnesota's progressive policies are far more aligned with Canada than the rest of the U.S. Think healthcare, social programs, and environmental policies, things that are right in line with Canada's values. Minnesota has long embraced ideas that echo those north of the border, so the political transition from Minnesota to Canada wouldn't be a huge leap. And here's something that'll really blow your mind. Minnesota wasn't always part of the U.S. Before it became a state in 1858, Minnesota was under British control. The fur trade? Strong ties to Canada. Many residents even have family across the border or hold dual citizenship to this day. Now, here's the kicker. Some experts even believe that if the U.S. ever faced serious political or economic instability, Minnesota could turn to Canada. With its strong connections both culturally and economically, it might not seem so crazy for Minnesotans to push for a shift toward their northern neighbors. And just when you thought Minnesota was the most surprising, there's one state left on this list with an even deeper bond with Canada. Keep reading. You won't believe how strong the connection is. Number 1. Washington. Washington. You might first think of the tech giants in Seattle or the vibrant coffee culture, but there's a much deeper connection brewing between Washington and Canada, one that might make you rethink this state's future. Washington's ties to Canada go way beyond simple geography. In 2023, Washington traded over $20 billion in goods with Canada, making it one of the most economically dependent states on its northern neighbor. But it's not just about trade. Washington also relies heavily on Canadian energy, particularly hydroelectric power flowing from British Columbia. So, when you step back and look at how interconnected these two regions are, it's easy to ask, could Washington ever be better off as part of Canada? But it's not just about the economy. Politically, Washington's policies are much more in line with Canada's than with many other U.S. states. On issues like healthcare, environmental protection, and social services, Washington's progressive stance is far more in sync with Canada than with the more conservative policies seen in other parts of the U.S. And this alignment goes even further. Washington has actively pursued closer ties with British Columbia, including proposals for high-speed rail that would connect Seattle to Vancouver in under 2 hours. A project that demonstrates a clear intent to integrate more with Canada. The cultural overlap between Washington and Canada is undeniable as well. From Vancouver to Seattle, people share similar lifestyles, from outdoor adventures to a tech-driven economy, and yes, a shared love for coffee. People cross the border regularly, with many British Columbians working in Washington while still calling Canada home. It's almost as if Washington already operates as a Canadian province in many ways, just without the official title. And here's the real kicker. Some politicians in Washington have floated the idea of deeper economic integration with Canada. If the U.S. were ever to face a political or economic crisis, it wouldn't be too surprising if Washington looked northward rather than eastward for solutions. With all the state's economic, political, and cultural ties to Canada, it's easy to imagine serious conversations about whether Washington might be better off joining Canada instead of remaining in the U.S. Washington is the most intriguing example of a state with deep connections to Canada, and when you look at its economic, political, and cultural ties, the idea of a shift northward might not be as far-fetched as you think. And there you have it. Could these states really consider joining Canada? The connections are stronger than we might think, but only time will tell if they ever take that step. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more surprising insights. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next one.